The successful domestication of man. A dog is usually happy with life and loyal to his or her master, not even seeming to recognize their lack of freedom. The dog has been bred to serve man for thousands of years, and the master takes the dog for granted. The dog expects the master is watching, waiting to give praise, orders, or reprimand, and the dog is grateful. The dog doesn't know how to survive in the man's world without him, for man knows what's best, and he provides purpose. The master is accepted with adoration, respect, and appreciation. For the dog, the master gives meaning to life, and for the dog, ignorance is truly bliss. What enslaves humanity? What can people not live without? How can we be free? These questions are very important, but for many the answers are not so simple. Will Rogers, in his Diary of America, said, "Sure must be a great consolation to the poor people who lost their stock in the last crash, to know that it has fallen in the hands of Mr. Rockefeller, who will take care of it and see it has a good home and never be allowed to wander around unprotected again. There is only one rule that works in every calamity, be it pestilence, war, or famine. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The poor even help arrange it." If the poor can be guided in a particular direction, they can be trained to unknowingly provide the means of making the rich richer and even be thankful for this. There was an evangelical preacher whose sole message was money is good and God intended for all Christians to be rich. This was the message in a nutshell. The preacher paced himself when delivering his message and even had intense music playing with which his preaching seemed to keep rhythm. By the end of the message, he seemed to have everyone there convinced that the more money they brought up to the stage for him and his ministry, the more money God would bless them with for giving out of the goodness of their hearts. People rushed to the stage, and soon there were piles of cash at the preacher's feet. The whole process seemed so simple. How much more is this simple method applied to the masses on a far greater scale? A society full of sheep naturally entices the wolves. What this preacher did is being done by those who have been wealthy for generations. There are those who know the game quite well, and they have even made the rules for how the game is played. Those who do not know the rules of the game may live a happy life spent with family and friends. They only accept the label of being middle class or blue-collared as a stamp of honor. And they live faithful lives at times, being thankful for what they do have. People will try to convince you of their beliefs and convictions because it reinforces their beliefs and convictions. If a belief and conviction needs something to reinforce it, then it can't stand on its own. Choose to remove erroneous beliefs and temper your convictions with facts and not supposition. Then and only then will you be able to understand divine truth. Professor Dean A. Banks. Some of the elite in society will try to convince us of certain beliefs and convictions which they do not believe in. They will do this so as to reinforce their agenda. If they can persuade you into seeing things in the way they want you to, then you can be led by them willingly, although unknowingly. By habit or ritual, people are more likely to listen to what the wealthy have to say before they listen to someone who is poor or middle class. Because of this mindset, certain beliefs are allowed to form which shouldn't be able to stand. The fact that we cannot survive right now and provide for a family without oil, electricity, and plenty of money is the evidence in how the wealthy control the masses. If we choose to remove erroneous beliefs and temper our convictions with facts and not supposition, then and only then will you be able to understand the divine truth I'm going to share with you here. To solve any problem or to discover the cause, the proven method is to go to the foundation of the quandary. Go to the root of the problem. So what commodity do people feel they need much of today, which in reality we shouldn't need at all? Let's try looking back at the origin of the black gold rush, or more so, those who started the significant expansion of the oil industry. The world's first billionaire was John Davidson Rockefeller, America's most generous philanthropist. Rockefeller's wealth was based largely on the near global control of oil refining. It's documented and well known how he also had large interests in other monopolies. As the economist Anthony Sutton notes, Rockefeller controlled the Copper Trust, the Smelters Trust, and the gigantic Tobacco Trust, In addition to having influence in some Morgan properties such as the U.S. Steel Corporation, as well as in hundreds of smaller industry trusts, public service operations, railroads, and banking institutions. National City Bank was the largest of the banks influenced by Standard Oil Rockefeller. But financial control extended to the U.S. Trust Company and Hanover National Bank and major life insurance companies. Equitable Life and Mutual or New York, Wall Street, and Bolshevik Revolution, 1981, is my source of this information. John's descendants are said to have been hard-working German immigrants, and his father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman, rumored to have excelled as a con man. He sold bogus products to the sick and desperate, being able to convince many to buy expensive remedies that were either useless or downright dangerous. How would he go for months and come back with a great roll of money? He would go to small towns, advertising himself as the celebrated Dr. Livingston. William announced he could cure anything, but made a specialty of cancer and kidney troubles. Source: McDonald, Double Life, New York World Magazine, February 2, 1908. John Rockefeller learned all he needed to from his father, and he dropped out of high school in 1855 to take a business course. John was motivated, and soon he also was able and ready to take on the world like no one in America before. John watched the trends, recognizing the predictability and gullibility of humanity. He was inspired by what he saw, and his vision was forming a vast vision which seemed to have no limit. When he recognized just how much humanity was like sheep. The Civil War compelled him into the oil business in 1863. John, along with others from wealthy families like J.P. Morgan, paid $300 to avoid conscription, a small price to pay, while thousands less fortunate died in the war. Of course, this is one of the rules to the game, though. The wealthy make wars or support them, and they benefit financially, while the young and poor die fighting for what they view as a just cause. Like a loyal servant to his or her master, many brave people die for a lie. John sold whiskey at inflated rates to federal soldiers during the onset of the war. He invested his profits into oil refineries next. The South was supplying turpentine to the North for the campaign-fueled lights. When the war cut off the North's access to this fuel, kerosene, from Pennsylvania, oil quickly took over as the lamp fuel of choice and stimulated John's oil business. John was young, but he knew the rules of the game. He was able to control people and situations to his advantage. John and a few partners organized the Standard Oil Company in 1870 with capital of $1 million. This company was built through him buying out competitors, price cutting, and controlling secondary businesses related to pipelines, trains, oil terminals, and barrel making. By 1880, his monopoly controlled the refining of 95% of America's oil. In a few years, 70% of Standard Oil's sales were overseas, largely to Northern Europe and Russia. The properties were merged into the Standard Oil Trust with an initial capitalization of $70 million, and by 1900 Rockefeller controlled about two-thirds of the entire world's oil supply. John was also director of the U.S. Steel Corporation when it formed in 1901. John used a commodity like oil to conquer the world. He helped make dead dinosaur ooze into a valued commodity. A product which people would fight for and invest millions into. Many people looked up to John Rockefeller. Many admired him and saw him as a generous person, and many felt they needed him in their lives. He knew what the world needed, or so this is what many believed. He cared for the betterment of humanity, and was one of the most generous philanthropists the world has known. He provided thousands with jobs, eventually millions, and he provided oil to all who needed this. Eventually, people were more dependent on oil than any other commodity. After a few generations, the habit was ingrained into humanity, almost to the point where one might say they seemed to need oil, and what oil provided as much as one needed water. It was in 1911 the U.S. Supreme Court had Rockefeller's monopoly dissolved into about 36 companies. Many of these oil companies are household names today, like Chevron, Amoco, Mobil, and Exxon. Rockefeller still profited from his change and the loss of this monopoly, and his descendants still profit today. Today, oil is the #1 source of profit for the most wealthy and elite in society. Even though we have the technological means of running vehicles and other machines on something other than fossil fuel, we do not. In the year 2012, humans still rely on oil, but the only reason this is still the case is because the rich are not ready for change, not as long as they still make a profit. People are bred to feed the greed of a select few. We were domesticated thousands of years ago. Before the rise of the Rockefeller dynasty and the prevailing commodity of oil, there was others like John Rockefeller. Those who used the rules of the game to change the way the masses reasoned. They planted the seeds of persuasion, which grew from generation to generation. The game had been used before, with bronze, silver, gold, and other precious stones and minerals, where even the ages of man were defined by the reigning commodity of the time. The idea of these commodities being of immense value and greatly desired was a seed planted by the masters, something the wolves used to enslave humanity in different centuries. The wild is free, and the wild is balanced. Back in the days when we were walking alongside other humanoids like Neanderthal and Homo erectus, we were aggressive creatures, but physically and intellectually superior to modern-day humans. Although we were struggling to survive in a harsh environment and times could be hard, we were free. Today, though, we're more like dogs. The dog is a different creature today than his ancestors were over 40,000 years ago. You can see this by looking at the modern gray wolf, for based on genetic evidence, this is the animal the dog once was. When the wolf was domesticated, quite a few physical or morphological changes occurred. The most significant changes happened within only several generations. Changes in coat coloration and markings. Reduction in overall size, a shorter jaw initially with crowding of the teeth and the shrinking in size of the teeth. A reduction in brain size, resulting in changes to cranial capacity, affecting the areas of the brain relating to alertness and sensory processing. The wolf, once becoming a tamed dog, had lost the skills necessary for survival in the wild. He depended on man more than what would have been natural instincts. A recent experiment done by the Russian scientist Dmitry Belevich has proven just how quickly an animal can evolve under the right circumstances. His research and methods have helped us better understand the domestication of our own most loyal servant, the dog. Dmitry wanted to reenact how domestication may have occurred, and he did this through the farm fox experiment. Wild silver foxes were selectively bred for 40 years, and the result was more dog-like animals that were friendly towards humans. The domestic elite foxes actually sought out human attention and indulged in human affection after only a human generation. The most fascinating observation by Dmitry was the change in physical traits which paralleled the selection for tameness, even though the physical traits were not originally selected for. The once wild silver foxes were giving birth to foxes with floppy ears, spotted or black and white coats, tails that curled, and even the barking vocalization and earlier sexual maturity was noticeable. The silver fox was literally turning into a dog because of the breeding of the tamer ones with even tamer ones. It was reported by those involved in the experiment, on average, the domesticated foxes respond to sounds 2 days earlier and open their eyes 1 day earlier than their non-domesticated cousins. More striking is that their socialization period had greatly increased. Instead of developing a fear response at 6 weeks of age, the domesticated foxes don't show it until 9 weeks of age or later. Their whimpering and tail wagging is a holdover from puppyhood, as are the foreshortened face and muzzle. Even the new coat colors can be explained by the altering timing of development. One researcher found that the migration of certain melanocytes, which determine color, was delayed, resulting in a black and white star pattern. The wild was bred out of the silver fox in such a short time, and the physical changes show a far more vulnerable-looking creature, an animal dependent on humanity. The Cro-Magnon man was different than the modern-day man. He even looked different. And like the farm fox in the experiment, man started out wild and free. Cro-Magnon had more meat on his bones. He had broader shoulders and massive muscles. As a general rule, science says to control massive muscle blocks, the more brain you need. This may also be partially why the burly Neanderthal had larger brains than modern-day Homo sapiens. 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, the Homo sapiens with the biggest brains lived, with his broad chest, larger teeth, strong jaws, standing 7 feet tall, and Cro-Magnon man was also brilliant. Recent studies of human fossils suggest the brain shrank more quickly than the body in near modern times. Scientists discovered that as the human population rose and societies became more complex, the brain actually started to shrink. When humans didn't have to be as smart to stay alive and they could depend on other supplies to provide for them, their intelligence decreased. The Cro-Magnon man became the Homo sapiens we are today because we've domesticated ourselves, according to Dr. Richard Wrangham, a primatologist at Harvard University. He notes on how every domesticated animal had lost about 10 to 15% of brain volume when compared with their wild ancestors. Wrangham also points out the physical changes. Homo sapiens today have slighter builds than the Cro-Magnon, as well as smaller teeth and smoother faces, equivalent of the floppy ears and curled tails on the transformed foxes of gray wolves. The humans who live today have had much of the aggression from the wild bred out of them, leaving us more susceptible to others ruling over us. Today the modern man depends on the wealthier, thus supposed more intelligent individuals to rule over us, instead of the larger and strongest of humans like in ancient times. Ironically, the bigger and stronger Cro-Magnon was probably more intelligent than those we consider wise today. What many people don't realize, though, is that the wealthiest people today are not always the more intelligent. They simply follow the simple rules to a game which has been passed down to them by their wealthy elders. They rely on the fact that ultimately people today are stupid and usually not too aggressive to be deemed as threatening. The story written on our bones is that we look more and more peaceful over the last 50,000 years. And that is not all. If Dr. Wrangham is correct, domestication has also transformed our cognitive style. His hunch is based on studies many done by his former graduate student Brian Hare, comparing domestic animals with their wild relatives. The wealthy elite may have been using the rules of the game passed down for generations, but they are not of superior intellect, and the evidence is there to be seen. Just looking at our present economy and our nation's rising deficit, this shows how those who rule over the masses have a flawed system in place. They're getting complacent because they're getting dumber. Those of elite status who ruled over humanity in Roman times, they also showed how their system was flawed as the world fell into the Dark Ages. History is about to repeat herself once again. In Utah, the NSA, National Security Agency, is constructing a data center unlike any other. The purpose is to intercept, decipher, analyze, and store vast swaths of the world's communications sent through satellites and through the underground and undersea cables of international, foreign, and domestic networks. The heavily fortified $2 billion center is scheduled to be running in September 2013. Flowing through its servers and routers will be all forms of communication, including the complete contents of private emails, cell phone calls, and Google searches, as well as all sorts of personal data, trails, parking receipts, travel itineraries, bookstore purchases, and other personal information from billions will be stored in these near-bottomless databases. In the process, and for the first time since Watergate and the other scandals of the Nixon administration, the NSA has turned its surveillance apparatus on the U.S. and its citizens. It has established listening posts throughout the nation to collect and look through billions of email messages and phone calls, whether they originate within the country or overseas. It was created as a supercomputer of almost unimaginable speed to look for patterns and unscramble codes. Finally, the agency has begun building a place to store all the trillions of words and thoughts and whispers captured in its electronic net. This evidence has been gathered by James Bamford and was published in the Wired magazine. Google National Security Agency, invasion of privacy for further information on this subject. Why do we allow this invasion of our privacy? This leech from the NSA is obviously destined to drain what's left of our presumed freedom in America. We are living in a time where humanity accepts such an obvious invasion of privacy and a precursor to the complete visual loss of our freedom. We allow this because the data center is supposed to protect us from future cyber attacks and other terrorist threats. Some of the elite in society will try to convince us of certain beliefs and convictions. They will do this so as to reinforce their agenda. They feel no guilt in this, simply survival of the fittest. Their agenda is to stay in power and keep the masses feeding the rich. When people live in fear and they grow in ignorance, they will desperately trust in those who have power over them. Much of the time we depend on the knowledge of others and their technology for survival in this day, instead of thinking for ourselves and doing the research for ourselves. So we'll accept the invasion of privacy as humanity, and we will trust those over us because after all, we're not really free today. Ultimately, we'll place our trust in the wealthy elite. Even though we'll gripe and complain, we will depend on our masters. We will turn to those whom are supposed to have our best interest in mind, because we've been bred to. How many times are we going to insanely stand by as the wealthy elite claim the foul-smelling bitter fluid flowing over us is rain? The answer is time and time again, we will stand by, even till the last of our freedom is taken away. Some people have the dream of being like the wealthy elite. They dream of being higher on the food chain. So many people go into credit debt and lose thousands while pretending to be more like the masters they so admire. People have become creatures of habit, and the way we have been living for several generations has proven to be self-destructive, yet we continue with the self-destructive pattern. Eventually, even the wealthy elite will not benefit any longer from the ignorance of man. Thousands die in wars fought in vain, wars which have lasted for years. And only the wealthy truly benefit. People still live for the prearranged dream, though, believing wealth buys happiness and peace of mind. They're unable to recognize how all of the material possessions, their dependence on the prized commodity of oil, and the wasted, desperate desire of these keeps humanity enslaved. A man or woman is usually happy with life and loyal to their master, not even seeming to recognize their lack of freedom. They've been bred to serve a select few over them. They help the master grow in wealth, being satisfied with the scraps thrown to them from the feast. Humanity expects the master is watching, waiting to give praise, orders, or reprimand, and we are grateful, some of us even proud. We don't know how to survive in the present world without the wealthy elite. We need others in power over us. We accept the master with adoration, respect, and appreciation. For the dog, the master gives meaning to life, and for the dog, ignorance is truly bliss.